book with you? I do not. No, sir, Mr. Ed. We are out of the books. I can, if you don't have a book, email me, and I can send you at least an electronic copy. I believe it's page 26. Let me double check myself here. Yes, page 26. So if you have your book with you, we're on page 26. Now, in this class, we've been examining the Gospels as narratives. And earlier in the quarter, is this too loud? I feel like I'm too loud. Am I not too loud? Okay, gotcha. Feelings aren't facts. That's what Claire's telling me back there. Earlier this quarter, we were examining the Gospels in general, looking at some of their literary features, because after all, the Holy Spirit has chosen to communicate Jesus to us in the form of narrative. And so if we're going to understand the Gospels on a deep level, we need to pay attention to their literary composition, the fact that they're narratives. We need to read them that way. And we've started in this part of the quarter, we've started looking at each individual gospel. So we took a few classes to examine Mark, just noting some of the unique things about his narrative presentation of Jesus. Now we're going to begin examining Matthew's gospel. And in doing this, we will meet our second and third objective for this class. So up on the screen, I have my second objective for this class, which was that by the end, you will be able to apply a narrative approach to your interpretation of the Gospels. And I'm hoping, my aim is that as we do that together, as we did that in Mark's Gospel, as we do this today and next Sunday in Matthew's Gospel, that it just equips you where you start reading these Gospels yourself as narratives and you start gleaning fruits from that approach. And then we're also going to meet our third objective today, which is on the screen, which is that you will be able to provide examples of narrative insights from the Gospels and why those insights are important. And we'll be doing that today. We're going to look at some literary features of Matthew's Gospel, and then we'll glean some insights into what he's communicating with that approach. Now, in your class book on page 26, I have a call-out box there at the top on Matthew's plot and some phrases that he uses to advance his plot in his narrative. I'm not going to cover that today for time's sake, but I'll just refer you to it on page 26. And again, if you don't have a copy of the book because we're out, just email me. My email address is in the directory. It's also fairly easy to remember. It's pickupnathan@gmail.com. Just email me and I can send you an electronic copy of the book. I want to spend our time today looking at three literary features of Matthew's gospel. As we're approaching his gospel as a narrative, that's the form in which the Holy Spirit has communicated Jesus to us, we're just going to look at three. And so I want to stress, this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but we only have a limited amount of time, so I've just chosen three literary features to examine in Matthew's gospel. And then we'll look at what that helps us to understand that Matthew is communicating. So the first literary feature I want to discuss with you is fulfillment citations. Fulfillment citations. This is a unique characteristic of Matthew's narrative presentation of Jesus. I've given you in your book, in that second sub-bullet, some, not all, but some of the Old Testament citations that Matthew will deliver in the course of his narrative. And what I mean by this is, at various points in Matthew's gospel, 10 times, he will use this phrase or a variation of this phrase where he will say, this was to fulfill what was written by the prophet, and then he'll cite some Old Testament passage. He does that 10 times in the course of his narrative. And here's why he does that. He is developing the theme that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament Scriptures. He is developing the theme that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament Scripture. Now, to be clear, all 4 Gospels are permeated with Old Testament references and allusions, and all 4 Gospels have as one of their aims to present Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament Scripture. But Matthew in particular really stresses this theme. And he does it in a unique way in these Old Testament citations, where there's 10 of them. And those are not the only place where he will refer to the Old Testament. Those are just the most explicit, where he's basically signaling to the reader, hey, you need to understand Jesus in light of this Old Testament passage, because Jesus is fulfilling this. These 10 fulfillment citations are just the most explicit examples of him doing this in his gospel. Now, these are easy to skip over. If you read Matthew's gospel this week, if you listen to it, it's easy to just kind of get to those parts where Matthew says, this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, and then yada, yada, yada. It's easy to just skip over that and you just keep reading. But if you want to take your understanding of Matthew's gospel to the next level, take the time to go back to that Old Testament passage and read the entire context in which that passage is found. Because doing that will help you to better understand how Matthew is using the Old Testament. But it will also help you better understand exactly what he's claiming about this Nazarene. And you'll also find that Matthew's concept of fulfillment is much more sophisticated than we generally espouse. Now, we're going to do that together here. I want to illustrate that. I just told you, wherever you see one of these citations, go back and look at the passage. Let's do that. Let me illustrate that, and we'll see what insights we glean. I want to look at how Matthew uses Isaiah 9, verses 1 and 2. So first, turn with me to Isaiah. Let's look at the Old Testament passage first. Let's understand what it's saying in its context, so then we can understand what Matthew is saying when he claims that Jesus fulfills this passage. So go back to Isaiah 9, and we're going to read the whole context here. Whenever a gospel author explicitly quotes an Old Testament passage, they're not just drawing your attention to those few lines. Remember, there's no chapter and verse divisions in the world at this time. And so they're just using those lines to draw the reader's attention back to an entire context, because they don't have the luxury of saying, like we do, Isaiah 8, verse 11 to chapter 9, verse 1. They can't do that. So they just will give a few lines to draw your attention to the passage they're talking about in its context. Now, we're going to start reading in Isaiah 8. I think I told you to turn to Isaiah 9, but I should have said Isaiah 8. And we're going to start reading on Isaiah 8, verse 11, so that we can understand what Isaiah 9, 1 and 2 means in its context. Because then we'll understand what Matthew is claiming when he refers to that passage. Look at Isaiah 8, starting in verse 11. For Yahweh spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But Yahweh of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense, and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken. Bind up the testimony. Seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for Yahweh, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Behold, I and the children whom Yahweh has given me are signs and portents in Israel from Yahweh of hosts, who dwells in Mount Zion. And when they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? To the teaching and to the testimony, if they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. They will pass through the land greatly distressed and hungry, and when they are hungry, they will be enraged and will speak contemptuously against their king and their God, and turn their faces upward. And they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. Now, if you're not familiar with Isaiah, some of this may be mysterious to you. So let's just break it down here. And really the message Isaiah is giving, the general message is very simple. What he's telling Israel is that Israel will be exiled. That's the dark cloud hanging over this text, is that Israel and Judah are both going to be exiled for their stubborn rejection of Yahweh. That's the overall message here. In fact, they've so hardened their hearts against God that God in Isaiah 8 says, I will be a sanctuary to my people for those who turn to him, but I will also be a stumbling block and a rock of offense. And just incidentally, later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus will apply that passage to himself in Jerusalem. That he, as God with us, is the stumbling block that the Jewish teachers are stumbling over. And that suggests that Matthew's meditation on this passage and how it applies to Jesus came from Jesus himself, who referred to this passage in his teaching. But this also refers to the time of judgment of God as a time of darkness. But then, when you get to Isaiah 9, God then says, but the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, they're going to see a light. Well, what's that talking about? Well, in the immediate context of Isaiah, he's talking about the Jewish exiles. Let me show you with some maps here what I'm talking about. Or sorry, I forgot to put this bullet on the screen. So in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, the immediate message there is that the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, they're going to be the first to see the exiles end. The time of judgment will be over, and now the time of light has come, the time of God's mercy. Well, how is it that the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, how is it that they're the first to see it? Well, let me show you with this map. So you can see, well, maybe you can't see because of the lights up here. Let me bring my cursor over here. Well, even that's not showing up very well. But you can see right here in Zebulun and Naphtali, if you can see my mouse moving, I should have circled that. But up there in the north is the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. So again, just right up here, I'm trying to bring your eye to it right there. And when Assyria came, they came from the north. They're following the roads in that Middle Eastern world, and they're coming from the north. So when they reach the promised land, the land of the Hebrews, the first lands to experience God's judgment of exile are the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now you might be wondering, well, what about Asher? Because Asher's over there on the left, right here next to these lands by the sea. By this point in history, Asher had basically already lost their land to places like Tyre, and so they're just kind of already out of the picture. And then also, he's focusing on the boundaries of the promised land proper. So everything on the east side, or excuse me, everything on the west side of the Jordan. So it's the land of Zebulun and Naphtali who were the first to experience the punishment of exile when Assyria comes, because they're the first ones the Assyrians meet on the roads coming from the north. But on the flip side, when the exiles return and they're following that same road, the land of Zebulun and Naphtali are the first to have the promised people come back to the promised land. That land that had first experienced exile will be the first to see the exiles return. They'll be the ones to see that light of God's mercy. That's what Isaiah is talking about in this passage. In fact, in this second map here, I don't know if it shows up with our lights, but this striped area here, where you can see kind of the land is striped, that's showing territory of Israel that was taken by Assyria. And you really can't see it very well, but that land of Zebulun and Naphtali, which is over here, you can see faintly there that in New Testament times, that will be the land called Galilee. That'll be very important for when we get to Matthew here in just a moment. So, in the context of Isaiah, here's what he's saying. Israel has rebelled against God. They're going to be exiled. But the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, who were the first to be exiled by Assyria, they will also be the ones to see God's light of mercy, because they'll be the first ones to see the light of the returning exiles who are coming back to the land once God's time of judgment has passed. That's what this passage means in its Old Testament context. Now, flip over to Matthew 4, and let's look at how Matthew uses this passage and what he's claiming about how Jesus fulfills this passage. Matthew 4. And start reading with me in verse 12. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the regions and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Matthew is claiming that Jesus' ministry in Galilee fulfills Isaiah 9, 1 and 2. In other words, what Matthew is claiming is that Jesus brings the true end of exile. The previous end of exile, where the Jewish exiles returned, that was just a partial fulfillment of what God had promised. The ultimate fulfillment for when God said, my time of judgment, my time of exile will end, the ultimate fulfillment of that wasn't during the reign of the Persians. It was when Jesus of Nazareth came. He brings the true end of exile. And he chose to minister in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, Galilee. And what Matthew is claiming is that the light of Jesus' ministry comes first to the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. So what he's claiming is, when Isaiah spoke about that light that would come to the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, he was only partially talking about the return of the exiles. His true meaning, ultimate meaning of that, was the light of the Messiah, who was going to come and bring the true end of exile to the Israelite people and to all human beings. Zebulun and Naphtali were the first to experience the judgment of God in the exile, but they will also be the first to experience the mercy of God in the ministry of Jesus. That's what Matthew's claiming here. What questions or thoughts do you have on this? On either Isaiah 9, 1 and 2, or on Matthew's claim of how Jesus fulfills Isaiah 9, 1 and 2? What questions or thoughts do you have on this? Just, yeah. Yeah, what Julia just said is an excellent reflection. As you start looking at these Old Testament passages, it's going to spark all kinds of thoughts for you. And so Julia just shared, in Isaiah said, don't look to the dead for your answers. Now, in Isaiah's context, he's talking about those who were practicing divination and necromancy and all that. But interestingly, to Julia's point, we look to the one who's living. And in Isaiah, the point is you should be looking to the living God for answers. Well, we do in the living Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, interestingly, the Jewish leaders keep claiming that, well, their hope is in Moses. Well, Moses is dead. Jesus is the one who will be raised from the dead alive. There's all kinds of things there. In fact, another thing, too, that I thought reading Isaiah I couldn't help but think about was that when Isaiah says those who are going to experience God's judgment, they're going to be living in darkness. You just can't help but think then of the crucifixion. When these Jewish leaders are rejecting God, they've stumbled on the stumbling block. And darkness is the result. And they're so blind that they don't even see it. They don't even think to themselves, okay, well, wait a second. We might have been wrong here. What's going on? Doesn't even faze them. Yeah, Andrew? Yeah. Jesus is say, hey, the time. Time is now. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The time is right now. And that's evidence in all the things that Jesus is then going to be doing in their presence, which they will just reject. They stumble on that stumbling block. Yeah, very good. Very good. So just to summarize here, Matthew's point is that Jesus' choice to minister in Galilee wasn't just some random choice, like, oh yeah, it's just kind of nice here, I'll just stay here. It was fulfilling God's promise that the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, the first who had experienced exile, they will be the first to experience the end of exile, the light of God's mercy, and that comes with this man from Nazareth. That's what Matthew is claiming. Matthew has written a rich narrative that is in constant dialogue with the Old Testament scriptures. And to read his gospel as a narrative must include paying attention to this literary element. So when you see those times where Matthew refers back to an Old Testament passage, go back and look that up. It will dramatically enhance your understanding of what Matthew is claiming about this Jesus of Nazareth and will help you to understand Matthew's use of the Old Testament. Any other thoughts or questions on that literary feature before we go to the second one? One other literary feature that Matthew uses very skillfully is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing. And we talked about this earlier this quarter because all the gospel authors will use foreshadowing. But Matthew just very skillfully uses it, and it's just one of the literary features I wanted to take some time to look at. You may recall from our earlier class that foreshadowing is where an author hints or alludes to future events in the plot, future developments in the plot. We're going to examine one instance of Matthew using foreshadowing, but this is going to lay groundwork for next Sunday's class, because in next Sunday's class, what Matthew is foreshadowing in this passage we're about to look at, next Sunday we're going to trace that thread, that theme, throughout Matthew's gospel. We'll see how he develops it. But for today, we'll just lay some groundwork. Would you flip over to Matthew 2? Matthew 2. This is the episode of the Magi who come to visit the infant Jesus. Now, while you're turning there, I got to say this, and I've gotten fairly passionate about this over time. This episode, in some ways, has suffered from being a part of the quote-unquote Christmas story. And a lot of times during Christmas, it just bothers me where this episode is completely amputated from Matthew's gospel, and it's just treated as part of the sweet Christmas story, as if that's all that Matthew gave it to us for. He just knew, when they come up with Christmas, they're going to need some good stories about Jesus as a baby. I'm going to give them this one. But the fact is that Matthew includes this episode to start to develop very important themes that he's then going to trace out in the rest of his gospel. So any examination of this episode needs to first start with, what's the point of this episode in Matthew's gospel? And then once we understand that, well, then we can kind of, take it in isolation and branch off. But we need to first start understanding, why is Matthew recording this? So let's read it together here. Matthew 2, and just read with me verses 1 through 12. And then as we're reading it, think about the question, what might Matthew be foreshadowing here? Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. There is great irony here in this passage. We talked about irony in this earlier this quarter. There's great irony here. Who is it who comes to worship the King of the Jews? What ethnicity are these men? They're from the east. What ethnicity are they? Gentiles. Gentiles. These are not Jewish men. These are Gentiles. And from a Jewish standpoint, they have two strikes against them. They are Gentiles, and they also practice astrology, the study of the stars, not astronomy, but the finding meaning in the stars. Now, Matthew does not, that raises questions like, well, but okay, so is there some truth to that? Because they saw this star. Matthew doesn't get into that. He just leaves those questions unanswered. Because for him, that's not important. God utilized their practice of astrology, God utilized that to send them this message. And so they are coming as Gentile astrologers, which astrology was forbidden in the law of Moses. They have come to worship the King of the Jews. And when they find the infant, what is their reaction? When they see the star rest over the house, what does the text say is their reaction? They rejoice exceedingly with great joy, and they come in and they worship him or pay homage to him, give him gifts. What is the reaction of Jerusalem to this message that the King of the Jews has been born? What is their reaction? Miss Gloria, I think, did you say it there? Now, Herod will end up doing that. He'll end up killing, he'll seek to kill the little boys to try to eliminate this rival to his power. But in verse 3 of chapter 2, what is Jerusalem's reaction to this news that the King of the Jews has been born? They are troubled. And look at how the text aligns them with Herod. In verse 3 of chapter 2, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Jerusalem is on the side of Herod. Think of the irony here. The city of David is not rejoicing at the news that the Davidic king has been born. In fact, they're going to side with the one who seeks to kill this Davidic king. But these Gentile astrologers of all people, they have come to pay homage to the King of the Jews. Now, here's my question that I have in your book, although I've worded it slightly differently. What is Matthew foreshadowing in this episode? What do you think he's foreshadowing here? Yeah, Tasha? Say again, Miss Glenda? That the Gentiles are going to be included somehow in Jesus' ministry. And what'd you say, Tasha? Both of these things that what Tasha and Ms. Glenda have said, these are both being foreshadowed, but these are inextricably linked. I'll do it in reverse order. I'm going to go with Tasha's first here. One thing that Matthew is foreshadowing, he is foreshadowing the animosity that Jerusalem and its Jewish leadership are going to show Jesus all throughout his ministry, which will obviously culminate when they kill Jesus. That's one thing that he's foreshadowing. He's foreshadowing that eventual Jewish rejection of their Messiah, which is encapsulated in what they do to Jesus in Jerusalem. In other words, the ruler of Jerusalem who tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby but failed, the rulers in Jerusalem about 30 years later will be successful. And then the second thing that Matthew is foreshadowing, he is foreshadowing the eventual inclusion of Gentiles into Jesus' ministry, into his mission. Yes, Jesus is the King of the Jews, but his blessings will extend to all nations. And that is foreshadowed here by these Gentiles who have come to worship Jesus. And incidentally, we should say, that's what we're doing. To my knowledge, all of us in this room are Gentiles. And like the Magi, we have come this morning to pay homage and to worship and to bring our gifts to the King of the Jews, the Son of David. So this episode in Matthew's Gospel is not an episode that Matthew just included as a little Christmas time story. This episode is a key thematic foundation for themes he is going to then develop all throughout the rest of his narrative. It foreshadows the conflict between Jesus and Jerusalem, and it foreshadows the inclusion of Gentiles in Jesus' mission. Now, we will say more about that next Sunday. So I'll stop here for now. What questions or thoughts do you have on this episode and how Matthew uses it as an illustration, or how he uses it to foreshadow things that will come later in his narrative? What questions or thoughts do you have on this? Well, there's one more. There's one more literary feature I'd like to examine with you. And it's the literary feature called verbal links. This is something else Matthew uses, although other gospel authors use it as well. We looked at one of these with Mark, but I want to look at one that Matthew uses. Now, if you're using your book, I do need you to change something. I have an error in your book. Underneath this point, I have a definition in your book, but I accidentally gave you the definition for verbal threads. And there's a difference here. So just cross that out. Here is the correct definition for verbal links. Linking two episodes together with a common word or phrase. Linking two episodes together with a common word or phrase. Let me briefly explain the difference between a verbal thread and a verbal link. A verbal thread is where an author will repeatedly use a theme or a phrase and just repeatedly use it throughout the narrative so that it's like a thread that's just woven through. For example, Mark's use of that phrase, the way, in his gospel, which we mentioned in our Mark class, one of our Mark classes. But a verbal link is different. A verbal link is where an author will use a phrase or a word that reminds you of the other episodes. So it kind of links the two together, and it's the author's way of signaling, I want you to compare these two episodes together. Maybe to look at their similarities or their contrasts or both. Now, one example is what we looked at in Mark. Remember in Mark's gospel where we talked about the verbal link Mark uses, where when Jesus is baptized, he says the heavens were torn open. And then later in his gospel, he uses that same word to describe the tearing of the temple veil. Because Mark wants you to compare the baptism scene with the crucifixion scene. And we did that together. Well, Matthew does the same thing. He uses verbal links. And there's many we could look at, but I want to look at this one. Would you go ahead and flip over to Matthew 4? We're going to look at a verbal link Matthew uses to connect the temptation in the wilderness with the crucifixion scene. Matthew uses this verbal link of the phrase, if you are the Son of God. Now, Matthew will use that line in chapter 4, verses 3 and 6. We're not going to look at verse 6 for time's sake. We can just make the point by looking at verse 3. There's a lot to unpack in Matthew's temptation narrative. I wish we had time to do it. Lord willing, I'll be able to do it in a future class on Matthew's gospel. But we at least need to understand this point. So look at Matthew 4 and just start reading with me in verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now, first I want to note here what the issue is. What the issue is with this temptation. The issue here is not whether Jesus is the Son of God. If Satan is saying, hey, I'm not really sure you're the Son of God, so if you are, can you prove it by turning these breads into stone? That is not the issue. Satan knows exactly who Jesus is. Jesus has just been declared the Son of God immediately preceding this passage in the baptism scene. What Satan is getting at is, since you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, well then you have the power to deliver yourself from hunger. There's no reason for you to suffer. You're the Son of God. Use your power for yourself. Deliver yourself. What he's trying to get Jesus to do is to adopt a view of sonship that would pit him against the Father, where Jesus would now no longer trust God to deliver him, but he would then use his power to deliver himself so that he doesn't have to suffer anything. That's what Satan is trying to get Jesus to do. Now, Jesus will have none of it. Jesus knows that to be God's Son means to trust in God to deliver, even if that means suffering in the present while you wait for God's timing. Jesus will adhere to that. And he quotes Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, to show Satan, I'm not going to fail in this wilderness like Israel failed. I will be successful. I'm not going to put my position of authority, I'm not going to use that for my own self-gratification to deliver myself from suffering. I will wait for God to deliver. Now, with that in mind, flip over to Matthew 27. Matthew will now give us a verbal link. Look it over at Matthew, flip over to Matthew 27, and look what he has the crowds say to Jesus. Matthew 27, and start reading with me in verse 37. And taking, oh, excuse me, I'm in the wrong chapter. Matthew 27, all right, here we go. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then two robbers who were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Do you see what Matthew has done here? Matthew, in using that verbatim expression, "if you are the Son of God," he is drawing our attention back to the wilderness temptation, and Matthew is wanting us to compare these scenes together. What's happening here, what Matthew is depicting, is that Jesus is going through another test, just like he did in the wilderness, but this one is much harder. Because Jesus is being asked, if you are the Son of God, why should you be suffering like you are now? Use your power to deliver yourself. Come down from the cross. There's no reason for you to be up there if you are the Son of God. But Jesus, once again, will pass this test. And he will wait on God's deliverance, even though it means excruciating suffering for him in the present. He will not deliver himself. He will not use his power for himself. And notice that by Matthew using this verbatim expression, notice what he is alluding to about the spiritual behind the scenes going on. When the crowds say, "if you are the Son of God," and they're using the same phrase as Satan, who is Matthew aligning the crowds with? Satan. In other words, Matthew is doing literally what Mel Gibson did in The Passion of the Christ. Have you ever seen that movie? There's a scene, I can't remember where it is in the movie, but there's a scene when the crowds, they're all riled up, and Mary sees Satan just walking through the crowd. Now, Satan's invisible to everyone else, but Mary can see him. And Mel Gibson's point with that was, Satan is the one doing all this. This is just he's riling up the crowd. Matthew has literally done that same thing. He's claiming Satan was there at the crucifixion. He was using the crowds as his instrument to bring one more test to Jesus when he was presumably at his weakest. If you are the Son of God, you should not be suffering. Come down from the cross. You don't deserve this. But Jesus passes the test. And the irony here is that those crowds and the Jewish leaders who claimed, well, we executed Jesus because we care about God's laws. He's a falsehood. We're the guardians of truth. And this man is false. And so we're protecting God's laws. The irony is that Matthew shows us the reality, which is that they were just instruments of their true master, Satan. And the lesson for that in us is that sometimes people who claim loyalty to God, they can in fact be agents of Satan. The worldview of Matthew is that Satan is active in creation, and he stirs up human beings to do his bidding. And sometimes those people he uses are people within the covenant community of God. So we need to be on guard, first for ourselves. Where am I aligned here in my life, what I'm doing? But we also then need to be on guard as a community, as a church. Who are we aligned with as a group? Are we aligned with Jesus? Or have we become just instruments of Satan, deluding ourselves? Now, those are some examples of just some narrative insights that you get when you were reading Matthew as a narrative, and you're looking at those things he's doing literarily to make his points. Next Sunday, I've given you one guided reading question that's at the bottom of page 27 of your book, and it's this question. What episodes in Matthew's gospel foreshadow the Jewish rejection of Jesus and the inclusion of Gentiles in Jesus' community of disciples? We looked at one already, the Magi. That foreshadows it. I want you to read Matthew or listen to it and look for others. What are some other episodes where Matthew seems to be foreshadowing the eventual Jewish rejection and or the inclusion of Gentiles? What are those other episodes in his narrative where he develops that theme and traces it through his gospel? And we'll look at that together next week. Thank you so much for your time today. I've gone a little over. I appreciate you staying with me. God be with you this week.